Cool. We have consent from all the teams. Thanks very much, everyone, for that. So with that being said, can we call on the Prime Minister, please? Here.
Like I said, POIs in the chat, please. Okay. Ready, set, go. So the speech is going to start with characterization and then two independent arguments. Our characterization is, what would the criminal justice reform have done instead? Through the 1980s and 90s, it was clear that the criminal justice system was broken. Incidents like the Rodney King riots in LA put the misconduct of the justice system on the national stage. The criminal justice reform movement has a ton of leverage, and we think they should have spent it elsewhere when there's already all this publicity going towards drug offense. Direct huge amount of political capital can go elsewhere in this case, instead of solely focusing on drug crimes. Where does that political capital go? We say that non-violent, non-drug offenses are a new focus. Why is this the case? 4 reasons. The anger that people have against an unfair justice system has to be channeled somewhere, and the vast majority of crimes are non-violent, things like shoplifting, traffic violations, or illegal immigration. So there are more supporters for changing the rules on these kinds of crimes because more people have personally experienced incarceration stemming from them, or have family members or people in their community that have experienced incarceration from those non-violent, non-drug offenses. It's much easier to be empathetic for non-violent offenses because the harm suffered by the victim is relatively small compared to focus on violent offenses, and these crimes tend to be more spontaneous and unorganized. For example, gangs probably don't do a lot of petty shoplifting. This reduces the social stigma around these crimes when there's a focus on them and makes it easier to reform sentencing around them, which is the ultimate goal. What does this look like? This looks like lobbying lawmakers, public advocacy and protests, and spending money hiring lawyers and pro bono compensation, as well as soliciting grant money from corporations and foundations. This is what the criminal justice reform movement could have focused on if it pursued this alternate path. When as part of this alternate path, a no focus at all approach, or focus on things across the board, provides funding for due process, access to pro bono eviction, class action, immigration, anti-discrimination attorneys. Especially for immigration, we got to look at the years-long court backlog that neither party has channeled effort into solving, where there is more of a public effort into the drug offenses that we see already. And so there's it's even more uniquely important for the criminal justice reform movement to have looked at these issues that have less political fame. Our constructive arguments are twofold. First, why does the focus on nonviolent drug offenders not work, and therefore not be worth spending that much time on? First, drug users are harder to help than non-drug users. Drug treatment is still in its infancy, and rehabilitation is often underfunded or just straight up not available. Many of those targeted by the war on drugs tend to be poor, so that when they get out of prison, they cannot access rehab even if it was available. In the 1980s, new techniques for treating drug users like harm reduction aren't readily available back then either. This means that when drug users leave prison with shortened sentences, which would be an impact that might bring up of them focusing on on drug offenses, when they leave in that time, they often return to reusing because there's not adequate support. There was not adequate support at that time for the justice side. Note that this operates both on the level of reality and perception, meaning that when the criminal justice reform movement is tackling this, there's not only the reality that people coming out of prison will not necessarily have the resources to support them, but also the perception that it might not be worth it. That leads to some publicity problems as well. Second, this elicits anti-drug propaganda and fear-mongering, which is, again, why nonviolent drug offenders focus does not necessarily work. The president, attorney general, state governors, prosecutors, the vast apparatus of the criminal justice system is engaged in a massive war on drugs with anti-drug hysteria fueled by Nancy Reagan, Just Say No, those types of campaigns. Remember, again, that there are people who are directly affected by this too. In the present day, people who have lost loved ones to overdoses from fentanyl are also unlikely to hop on board with reform for drug laws, because they've been affected negatively by the presence of drugs. When you directly challenge this massive anti-drug hysteria that's across the population, especially back in that time period, you're fighting a losing battle. Instead, on our side of the house, you don't ally with the criminal justice system, but you form a cautious and mutually beneficial alliance where you can convince the attorney generals and DAs that loosening sentences for non-violent, non-drug offenses will help society overall without getting into the mess that would be dealing with the anti-drug hysteria movement. Op will say, but these people are the enemy. Sure, but they're powerful enemies to have. The Reagan administration can marshal propaganda to make the reform movement look like pro pro-drug hippies or pro-crime demons. The impact of this is that less people are willing to donate money, volunteer time to help your cause, or come to your protest because of the anti-drug hysteria that's sweeping the population. There's also an empirical evidence that the focus on drugs hasn't necessarily worked. It hasn't decreased the proportion who are incarcerated. If we look at the case statement, that's not a significant decrease from the info slide, especially since people are getting out over time. So there is that empirical evidence behind it. I'll take the POI from CO.
What is the biggest reason in America why people are incarcerated?
I think it's not that important exactly that this percentage is 20%. In general, it would be something like poverty, and like either way, the vast majority of it would fall into this nonviolent, non-drug offense type of thing that would be addressed if the criminal justice reform could focus its time and energy and resources on alternate efforts. Second, why does switching to nonviolent, non-drug offenses, as I'm talking about, create both a stronger criminal justice reform movement internally and help more people externally? Having a wider range of issues and stakeholders encompassed within the nonviolent, non-drug offender camp ensures that all reform movement members have a stake and are passionate about supporting and promoting the movement. They've all joined because they have a specific cause within this wide portfolio that the movement is addressing. The impact of this is that the internal movement is more robust. It's better funded when more people are interested and willing to donate. They also can attract funding from corporate donors better because those corporate donors have specific giving priorities. If they don't include the specific cause of drug offenses, the reform movement loses out on a lot of potential funding. Whereas when they have a wider portfolio, they can get more funding, and then therefore they can make larger impacts when it has multiple focuses and more money and more support. Outside of the internal movement itself, stakeholders across society derive benefits from this. There's greater political capital and focus on the issues of immigrants, Native Americans, and others facing class action and workplace discrimination, issues that would be helped and brought to the forefront without conflicting with the anti-drug hysteria group by this focus from the CJR movement. It also elevates concerns of these interest groups to the national stage because they lack already a lot of infrastructure to, have that publicity. The impact of this is greater political representation, better policy to deal with the issues of those multiple stakeholders. Another way that you're helping more people externally is that there's greater selectivity where you can pick and choose the types of crimes that are most likely to be overturned or where your resources are most likely to make an impact instead of artificially constraining yourself to solely drug offenses. There's less recidivism because drug use is a huge predictor of recidivism. It's literally criminalized right now. Getting more people out of jail on our side of the house will happen since they're less likely to get locked up again. They're less likely to be to revisit. The impact is both intrinsic and instrumental value. Intrinsically, it's good to get more people out of mass incarceration, and instrumentally, it makes the movement look better when recidivism rates drop, leads to further growth of the movement. It's a positive loop. You can win elections and install progressive prosecutors. I'm proud to propose.
We thank the Prime Minister for that speech. Can we now have the leader of the opposition, please? Here.
Great. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. I'll most likely take a POI from closing, probably around the 5-minute mark verbally, please. 3, 2, 1. Now, one piece of framing before we go into two arguments. Firstly, why these offenders are dealt with very unfairly and why there's structural reasons to put these individuals behind bars. Second, why there's an ability to mitigate sentencing and why that is most effective on our side of the house. Firstly, I think there's a finite amount of money on both sides of the house because the CJR movement is not the CJS movement insofar as this is probably a grassroots social movement and doesn't necessarily have that much money and doesn't necessarily have the state predisposed to them and having all of these resources in their toolbox. What does this necessarily mean? This means that at the point in which the reform movement has a certain amount of capital with which it can campaign for change, fund initiatives, or otherwise exert influence, I think we care more about offsetting inequality within the justice system and helping the worst off. So on a framing level, there exists a responsibility to use the finite amount of resources and influence that we have in the most effective and optimal ways. But second, I think the reason as to why this is important is because it implicates lots of the Gulf positioning, right? Because OG says, aha, guys, we can just support lots of other things. But the problem is, at the point in which there's a finite amount of capital and manpower, if that is their comparative, you never get any solvency for any of the issues that they seem to care about because your groups are stretched thin and you can't do any issues well. There's two reasons as to why this is incredibly bad, and I think this puts OG at the back leg. First, I think at the point in which you go 1 inch deep on every movement in comparison to rallying all of your individuals and rallying all of your support and resources onto one particular issue, this necessarily means that I just don't think people are going to donate because the threshold for donation is probably true that one, they have faith that you can actually do this well, but second, they actually know know that you've had long-standing history and have the capacity to able to do this, none of which you have if you pivot the movement, because you have to do things like reestablish new connections. You have to do things like be able to talk to new lobbyists, which I don't think you have the capacity to do so, especially at the point in which you have to deal with a plethora of issues now in comparison to just one. But the second response here is that even if it is true that lots of donors and you get more broad support on their side of the house, I think at the point in which you focus on lots of different things, they lack the capacity to do this, and this operates on a higher level. Why is this the case? Because at the point in which, one, you have less historical relations or less historical ability to communicate with these individuals, this probably means that you're not able to get reform, because I don't think reform comes with just money. It also comes with being able to negotiate and being able to lobby and to be able to talk to legislators who are in charge of posting these policies in the first place. At the point in which you don't have a foothold in the door, you cannot necessarily enter it. But second thing here, therefore, I think at the point to which feasibility has to be accounted for, because there are finite amounts of resources, I think this just kicks OG out unless they adopt a completely new comparative. I think first argument then as to why the offenders are dealt with are very unfairly, right? Because look, non-violent drug offenders are a unique group in terms of how they are charged and how inequality manifests in their treatment. They're likely to be treated far worse for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I think over-policing in minority neighborhoods means you get more of these individuals caught, searched, etc. The structural reason for this is that policemen often have quotas and stuff, or often want to be able to show that they're competent, and they therefore go for the low-hanging fruit of seeing that this minority, when the state where weed is legalized, necessarily has weeds in their pockets, and therefore are likely to use that for the jurisdiction of, aha, I caught one criminal. But second, there's structural failures and inequities, which means that these communities tend to be more at risk of drug addiction and endemic problems in the first place, at the point in which they are forced with no other option, at the point in which they therefore turn to drugs as a form of catharsis. But third, I think discrimination within the court systems also means they get far worse verdicts. This is a huge problem, because at the point in which there are necessarily places in the deep south where you fudge jury groups with people who disproportionately do not actually recognize the needs and helps of those minorities in the first place, or people that are relatively detached from these individuals' lived experiences, you're just far more likely to get mis-sentencing or mistrials for these particular individuals. What does this mean? I think this is therefore different from the OG saying like gangs don't do petty shoplifting, because even if petty shoplifting what's the burden, I think minorities are likely to also do this for the structural reasons that we told you. Why is this comparative then? Because look, I think this is different from violent offenders if this is what CG tries to go for or something, right? In the point in which these individuals who did not necessarily facilitate violence in the first place are individuals who do not violate the social contract. They did not impose another person's liberty at the expense of their own, and therefore not be punished to the same magnitude or the same individuals that were done so. The second argument then is that I think mitigating sentencing is much more effective on our side of the house, because I think it's more easy to sway sentencing and policies on non-violent drug offenders. Three reasons. First, on the viscerality of the harm, right? At the point in which the white man envisions that this could be a potential threat to their own security, there's more justifications for you to lock these individuals up. But second, there's more ability to co-opt support on our side of the house, because for the same reasons that they tell you this is already a condition that's necessarily getting better, but also that people from white families probably care about this significantly more than the counterfactual of doing things like of reform for like violent drug harms or other issues, because their children also have done non-violent drug offenses, which is a more proximate obligation to defend than those from Black communities. It is probably true at the point to which boarding schools and posh areas are breeding grounds for rich teens to smoke, but not the tipping point to which they conduct violence, because the ways in which they are judged, the ways in which they are locked up on our side, on their side comparative, are structurally less likely for these subsets of individuals. But third mechanism, it is technically easier to exonerate people on our side of the house because there's less burdens to uncover. On their side of the house, if they want to defend that these are individuals who have conducted violent means of drug offenses or necessarily other types of issues, I think this is not only the weed that they have to overcome in terms of a burden of exoneration, but also the fact that they conducted violence as a result of this, or whether or not this was done under the influence, etc. So there's much more hoops to jump over, and this therefore becomes especially hard to actually have any justice, because you first have to prove that these individuals are innocent, and that is the point to which you actually get leverage over the system in the first place. That burden is far higher on Gov. Before I move on, CG.
So this is a retroactive motion. How effective do you think this movement has been currently?
Not so effective, but sure. Even if we're able to buy that, like, I'll explain why this is important, right? Because first, I think the weighing is as follows. Even if this has not necessarily been as effective within the status quo, I just don't find that this is necessarily the sole reason, or why this is like the sole reason as to why this has not been effective, right? This means at the point in which, like, one, I think at the point in which your issues or what you've been investing towards has not been effective, this probably gives you more incentives to double down, because this probably means that it's an issue that hasn't necessarily been solved yet, so you can't pivot yet. But second, this also knives like OG's analysis of why historically, like, these are issues that necessarily have some slight level of efficacy for like mental health treatment and stuff. So you have to pick one of those on the comparative, right? But I think the weighing is as follows. There's two ways you do this. First, I think there's a great uncertainty of being able to get people out of jail because look, we're willing to concede that these numbers exist because of the fact that there are exogenous reasons as to why these individuals are locked up for the structural things we told you. Comparatively then, I think even if you go for violent drug offenders, this is incredibly dubious because one, violent crimes are harder to prove innocent. Second, it's harder to sway voters to opt into the system. Second implication, you're just able to help more people on our side of the house. Why is this important? Because look, if it is all minorities doing this in the first place, at the point in which you get some structural reform that also helps violent offenders, it helps all of the other issues that OG says are important. So I don't really care about how you go about doing this in the first place. At the point in which it impacts the same subset of individuals, i.e. doing things like having more mental health reform is probably a good thing for both violent and non-violent drug offenders, and having more scrutiny on judges in the deep south who have skewed juries, and it's probably also a good thing for all the crimes that minorities are likely to do out of necessity. Just because we say a problem hasn't been solved doesn't mean we ought not solve it in the first place. Proud to oppose.
We thank the leader of the opposition for that speech. We now call on the Deputy Prime Minister to say here.
I'll take POIs in the chat. Starting in 3, 2, 1. OO is out of the round because they didn't listen to the first thing Adam told you. Adam told you that logically, the criminal justice reform movement is smart. They're not going to shift from non-violent drug offenses to violent drug offenses, which are literally the worst thing in the public image. Instead, they'll look for easier wins. That is, things like non-violent, non-drug offenses that not only often don't have victims, things like a traffic violation, but also don't carry the stigma of drug use overall. I'll do a couple things in this speech. First, some more detailed rebuttal to opening opposition. Secondly, a new argument about, I guess, structural barriers within the criminal justice system towards drug reform specifically. And then finally, some prerequisite weighing at the end. Okay, let's talk about their framing. They say that there is finite money, so there's no solvency. I'll say the exact same thing for your side, right? There's finite money, which is why, as the POI from CG pointed out, or CO rather, CG, that it just hasn't worked, right? The info slide explicitly tells us that the proportion of people who are incarcerated who are drug users hasn't budged in the last 30 years. I think that's pretty explicit empirical evidence that their side hasn't worked, hasn't accomplished its goals. Secondly, what we'll tell you is that there is probably some kind of trade-off, right? If you're reallocating more resources towards non-drug offenses, then you have to take away some of the resources from reform for drug offenses. But we're willing to bite that bullet. In fact, it's the entirety of our case that there's just an over-allocation right now towards drug offenses, and that a more balanced allocation with a greater focus on non-violent, non-drug offenses would be more beneficial. Next, on donations and funding mechanisms, they say you're going to get less donations because you're less targeted. I think they have this the wrong way around. That is, if I work on more causes, I can appeal to individual donors who are like single issue donors who only care, for instance, about mental health within the criminal justice system because they've gone through those experiences before, or they have a loved one who's gone through them as well. Whereas on their side of the house, the only donors they're going to appeal to are those who've been personally affected by the war on drugs. That's a lot of people, sure, but you also miss significant constituencies that Adam tells you about. For instance, immigrant populations who are suffering under Reagan's Bracero program and the specter of ICE and who don't have legal counsel right now, just zero legal representation. It's really easy to help them by just putting an attorney in the room who can speak Spanish, but that doesn't happen on their side of the house because they've overcommitted to drugs. Next. On the negotiation of policy, we think, sure, we're also going to negotiate policy. We've talked to you explicitly about lobbying and advocacy on our side of the house. On their first argument about why being a drug offender is like really bad and there are lots of bad things that happen in overpoliced communities. Sure, but remember that this isn't just drug offenses, right? Like there are some drug offenses which are overpoliced, but also traffic violations are overpoliced, like homelessness is overpoliced, all these different kinds of like, I guess, interlocking and interlacing problems that happen in like marginalized communities, all of these are subject to the same kinds of things. They talk about discrimination, that also applies. And what we'll tell you is even in their best case, where they tell you that drug crimes are disproportionately over-policed, right? Like the police are just only going after people smoking crack and literally no other criminals. That's really bad for their side of the house. Why? Because it means that once these people get out of jail, where they haven't had any really rehabilitation, they're just going to recidivize. They're going to commit the same crimes again because police are literally hawk-eyed for those kinds of crimes. That means that the criminal justice reform movement doesn't solve anything because even if you reduce like someone's sentence from 10 years to 5 years, as soon as they get out, they're going to be rearrested for the same crime. On their second argument about swaying sentences, again, none of this is unique to drug crimes. First, they talk about viscerality and like being locked up because people fear drug crimes. Remember, we turned this. We told you that because of the Nancy Reagan hysteria, you're less likely to have allies within the criminal justice system, which is really important if you want to have someone like a progressive prosecutor make it into office. Then they say that white families are like care about drug crimes as well. But this directly contradicts their first point, where they tell you that there's discrimination in how drug crimes are prosecuted. That is, white people are probably going to get off with like powdered cocaine, whereas like black people who have crack cocaine are likely to be disproportionately prosecuted. There's some stat in like the new Jim Crow about like how the crack cocaine sentence is 23 times greater than the powder cocaine sentence, because like powder cocaine is used by white people and crack cocaine is used by black people. This means that on their side of the house, they don't bring white families into the political equation because white families see like the crack epidemic as a uniquely black problem. That's really bad because it means that you don't have a broad net. And if you only have black voters, you're unable to bring politicians to your side. Finally, on the thing about like there's less burden because the other crimes would be violent. We think this first contradicts the viscerality point, right? Like at first they say it's hard for judges to release people on drug crimes. Then they say it's easy because there's less burden. Pick one or the other. And secondly, we'll say we're also going after nonviolent crimes to reform. It's just non-drug, non-violent crimes. So we're removing both barriers, the barrier of drugs and the barrier of violence. Okay. Yeah, I'll take the POI from CO now, if there is one.
Yeah, sure. So you say that there are no allies in higher administration. I totally agree that's true in the time of Reagan and stuff. I think OO's point was more that you create those allies, if I'm not wrong.
Don't totally get the POI, but I think it's much easier to create allies on our side, where I guess like you don't have the drug stigma that exists, right? Like even today, if you tried to create allies right now, people would claim that you're like, spreading fentanyl on the streets, right? This is the reason like the San Francisco DA got recalled. There's still like this like drug hysteria all around. Okay. Actually, let's think about time. Yeah, I'll just do the prerequisite weighing instead. I think that the most important impact in this round is just movement building, and this is something that OO misses. They're out of the round for that reason. Why is this the case? Oh, actually, let me first explain our links into movement building. We'll give you a couple reasons. First, just broadly, you can affect a wider net of supporters. That is, there are many different kinds of crimes that are not drug related, and they're currently being left out by the criminal justice reform movement. When you broaden the net, you bring those people into the political movement, so they come to your protest, they promise to vote for the like criminal justice reform candidate, etc. Secondly, we'll note that there's lower recidivism for non-drug crimes. That's important for two reasons. First, because people who are locked up often can't vote. So if your primary constituency is people who are incarcerated, then they have zero political power because the Constitution has deemed it so. And secondly, because those people who are incarcerated are a really bad look for you, right? If they get out of jail and then recidivize immediately, it creates really bad optics for your movement. So you're unlikely to bring in external donors, foundations, etc. The way in here is simple. You need a movement before you can do anything. That is, the criminal justice reform movement needs to hire employees, needs to run ads, needs to lobby politicians. All of these things require money and people to do, which they don't get on their side of the house, which is the reason the criminal justice reform movement has failed over the past 30 years. For those reasons, proud to oppose.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. To close the opening exchange, can call on the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Okay, my name is Rahul. I'll take POIs in chat only, please. Hopefully I'm audible.
Yep.
All right, great. Okay, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. There will be 3 things in this speech. The first one is dealing with government's counterfactual. The second one is dealing with the DPM, wherein I think most of Gov's content actually comes out. And the last one is clarifying and weighing opposition against the closing half. So first, what is the counterfactual that OG tries to claim? They tell me that they're going to work on other like non-violent offenses, right? Because his anger must be channeled somewhere. I think the issue here is we're clearly also dealing with non-violent offenders, right? For that reason, I don't necessarily know why it is that all of the arguments they make about sympathy, about how when you don't cause people harm and you're seen as a victim of a system, people flock to your banner, I don't know why this can't be equally applied to our side. The only argument I get from them is, oh, drugs are perceived as much, much worse. I think this is a claim that lacks some nuance because yes, crack is probably seen as a pretty bad thing on both sides of the house, but I think the vast majority of people in this world who are actually taking these non-violent crimes and having problems, right, are those who are, like, for example, smoking weed and caught by the police. When you see that there isn't actually as much of a social stigma as OG wants to claim, because this isn't the 1980s or 70s, it's now. When you see that white teens and like privileged kids are also doing weed and things like that without nearly as much stigma as are those who are disadvantaged or minority groups, I think it's probably fair to say you get some level of sympathy and buy-in on our side. So if we have the same amount of capital, then Gov's burden was to prove that they could be more effective if they had done something else. I think this is the crucial burden they lack, because for the 14 minutes they gave you as to why it is that we weren't successful or couldn't have done it, they never actually told you how it was that they were going to use that money in better ways, what cause they were going to support instead. The one thing they tell me is we're going to spread this money across a lot of different baskets because that's somehow supposed to make us more effective. This falls to a variety of things. The first one is what Justin actually tells you, which is this movement specifically tends to be a grassroots movement with little capital, which is probably why we didn't get that much visible change in the first 20 years we did this. If it's the same capital you're working with, I don't know why spreading it thin is going to make you somehow so much more effective. But there are three main reasons why spreading it thin, which apparently is Gov's counterfactual, which they've claimed now, is necessarily bad for them. And I don't think CG can pivot away from this, so they're probably gonna have to defend it too. The first one is that you get less focus on individual causes, which just fundamentally means less support. Because it's not like I can just give a small speech about every single thing and then convince people. This, like, making actual change within the criminal justice system takes a lot of work. It takes your volunteers going out and paneling people. It takes talking to judges. It takes funding a bunch of ads and things over a long period of time to mechanize change. I don't know why it is that the movement on their side has the capacity to do this for 6 or 7 different individual causes if they're going to split their focus among them, simply because I don't think they have enough executives, enough power, enough marketing or campaign people to fix all of these issues if they're already struggling on fixing a single one. The second one is the inability to efficiently use funding to make change. Because if it's true that we're working with limited funding and there is a minimum gap that I need to pay funding to actually make something happen, it probably gets far, far worse on their side of the house when I now have the same amount of funding to put over a bunch of different things. This is the last reason they fall, because this is where DPM sneaks in the movement building idea. The idea that you can now appeal to a broader range of people, which gets you more funding, more donations, which fixes all these problems magically. Here's why this doesn't pan out, which kills OG's case. It's because what is the prerequisite to getting these people to buy in? I need them to know about my movement. I need to campaign them. I need to get the donations. I need to outreach to them. I need to put ads on billboards. I need to spend capital, panel, to access these people. But I don't have that capital, and I certainly don't have it to access so many different niches. So even if I'm broadly available, at the point at which, one, I'm not able to actually cause social change, so no one actually believes in me, but two, I'm not able to fund things that are going to lead to outreach, not able to buy billboards, not able to buy ad revenue, I don't know where I'm getting all these people donating in the first place that builds their movement building point. I think this means that OG probably falls. We get a clarification then from DPM on that the fact that they're actually looking for easy wins like traffic stops and things like that. Here's the other issue. These groups that fall to these specific crimes aren't over-criminalized and don't face injustice in the way that we tell you happen to drug offenders specifically, because we give you structural reasons why it is that drug offenders uniquely suffer from being over-criminalized based on their race, their ethnicity, structure, like where they live, things like that. That means that the harms done to these people are far, far higher, which means the delta we achieve when we help them, even marginally, is far, far greater than making people pay $50 less in fine for a traffic stop, right? Finally, then, we get an efficacy argument on the 4% idea. Let's deal with this. I think that, one, there are still tons of thousands of people. Like, think about this in the scale of it. We have helped tens of thousands of people who otherwise would be in jail, otherwise would be struggling far, far more. Absent government's ability to prove at all why it is they would somehow get a higher number if they want to make this on numbers on their side of the house, or if those higher numbers of people would be avoiding avoiding the same level of trumped up charges and the same level of damages that come from, as they say, being criminalized by the justice system on drugs, I don't know why it is that we have proved ineffective. But finally, I think that efficacy probably can happen in other ways, right? Because I think that any kind of movement we get here is prerequisite to getting more entrenched reform in the first place. Why? I think, one, this is significantly more feasible than any other avenue for the reasons that Justin gave you. Our entire second argument, which didn't really get refuted, as to why it's easier to mechanize change on this point. If that's true, then realize that once you've made change on a small thing, it's easier for you to cause bargaining for bigger things like violent crimes, for example. This This means that you start the conversation because the concession that one subgroup is being overcriminalized, which is what you get when you succeed on our side, means that you can have more conversations in places where overcriminalization overlaps and actually takes place far more. This is a gradual movement, which means I need small victories before I get big ones. The final thing we get, but first I'll take CG. OG.
You just told us that traffic stops aren't over-policed. Tyree Nichols would beg to disagree.
This was a POI. Okay. I just think that like it's kind of obvious that the criminalization of like drug charges and traffic stops is very different, and that's the argument we're making. Moving on, then they tell me that drug users can't be helped. Here's the argument there. It's like they basically just tell me that these people face structural barriers, right? That they're like over criminalized, that when they come out of jail, it's harder for them to get back on the wagon, which means they fall to other crimes. But isn't this the exact reason we should help them the most? All government has done here is proven that they are the worst off, that they face the worst harms, right? That they are unfairly treated, and that when they fall to drug offenses, right, it just means that they're more likely to fall to other offenses in the future, which means the 4% that we help there probably also help them stay out of the system in the future again. I think this is a concession they shouldn't make. Finally, then, let's weigh. I think OO proves two things. The first, that this group is unfairly punished often. They have more arrests and worse verdicts. I think this is already enough to win against OG, simply because we prove that there is a group that is underserved that we serve. But more importantly, we prove that we have a unique way to alleviate bad parts of the system in three key ways. One, the viscerality of these crimes is lesser than the other crimes we could focus on, which means we have a better chance of mechanized change. Two, we get buy-in from other groups in ways that they don't because of their movement's point failing. And finally, because it's easier to shift sentencing because of the crime itself. This finally means that we weigh in two ways, panel. One, who is the worst off and faces the most inequality? But secondly, what capacity do we have to help them? I think OO takes this debate because we prove, one, a group that has a huge amount of harms and inequality level of them, but two, we prove the capacity to help them that we don't have to help other worse off groups. With this in mind, so proud to oppose.
We thank the deputy leader of the opposition for that speech. To open closing exchange, we call on a member of the government, please. Here.
Okay, just give me 1 second. I'm gonna turn on the lights in my house. Sorry. I'll take POIs in chat, please, and I'll probably ask for one like halfway through my speech. We're going to take the hard stance in CG and recharacterize what we think the actual counterfactual is likely to be. So the counterfactual we're going to support then is we think the movement, realistically the counterfactual, would have supported causes for structural change. And the reason as to why this is the case is because we are going to analyze who historically actually composed the criminal justice system or the criminal justice reform movement and what their incentives likely are. So firstly, what exactly does structural change actually look like? I would suggest historically this looks like things like bias sentencing towards Black or African Americans, or the different immigrant communities as well. The fact that we have an unrepresentative jury system that oftentimes is predominantly white, where historically the screening for these juries was very poor, where they were poorly screened for racial biases, for other prejudices. Perhaps it looks like structural change for the prison system itself and how it's overcrowded and has terrible conditions for its prisoners. And the reason as to why this is likely then is because of the fact that the criminal justice movement was historically composed of, for example, immigrant communities or African Americans, because these are the communities that were affected by oppression historically and redlining that made them in very bad conditions and made them disproportionately prone to drug circulations, which is why these crimes disproportionately affected them and why these groups were the ones driving the movement in the very first place. So given this demographic in this context, the most likely counterfactual then is for these people to switch to other issues that disproportionately affect their community. And there's probably no other single crime that a movement can unilaterally agree on. And violence tends to be, quite unpersuasive, as OG themselves point out, and the movement probably knows this. So realistically, the movement's going to focus on the system itself insofar as they probably can't pick or agree on a single other crime. So this is why structural change is likely to be the realistic counterfactual. So how exactly we're going to reconcile this with OG? So I want to observe that OG probably just asserts their counterfactual. It's probably uncharitable that we have to necessarily agree with that. But also, we provide more structural reasons as to why this counterfactual is likely or more realistic. So given that the counterfactual world is empirically uncertain, well, I guess you could interpret it as like if we had to replay history 100 times, our world would occur probably more times in the world at OG. Or alternatively, you can say some people probably advocate for the OG cause, some people advocate for our cause of structural change, and we the movement splinters in this case. So with that being said, why is our counterfactual far better? Where first, I think we have better efficacy, which means we're going to flip all of the OO content on like faith and buy-in, and why we're going to unlock any practical impact in this round. There's a couple ways in which you get buy-in then. Where first, I would suggest you get better optics amongst moderates. Where the problem with drug crimes then is that people perceive drug crimes as quite bad, and therefore they are perceived as unjust that you're lowering the sentencing for these crimes. And perhaps OO, taking them in their best case, can say, you justify why you're lowering the sentencing by talking about structural issues that cause drug crimes. But I think the problem here is that people tend to latch on to the idea of drug crimes itself, and they play on historic stigma that was associated with these crimes, and just fixate on those things as opposed to the structural issues. It's far better on our counterfactual that we start off by talking about these structural issues in the very first place, and talk about how they lead to injustice, like disproportionate sentencing. And the nuance here is that moderates oftentimes might have prejudices, but they believe in broad values of equality and justice. So if you can point to systemic injustices within the criminal justice system, it's far more palatable to these stakeholders. But secondly, we get far more solidarity within the community as well, like within like the racial minorities community, like the immigrant communities. And this is because in the status quo, not all minorities agree that lowering drug sentencing is good. This is not a monolithic group. For example, there's like many Black conservatives, many people are hard on crime in these communities. And many of these people think like these drugs are harming my community. These people deserve to be punished. And this means there's a division within these like minority or marginalized communities in the status quo, and this reduces political will. The counterfactual is a world where we highlight systemic and specific structural injustices against your identity specifically, and it can get far more unity within the movement as a whole. And note before I take the POI, why this is the most important stakeholder, where people who are within immigrant and marginalized communities are the most likely to buy into the movement on the counterfactual because they are part of the people that are being marginalized, and they are personally invested in this issue versus perhaps detached moderates that top half hinges most of their clash on. I'll take a POI before I move on.
So solving structural issues on one part of the justice system also trickles down to other parts of the justice system. But on our side of the comparative, when you concentrate resources on one single issue, you're more likely to be successful in doing this. So we solve many problems if the framing is that many problems need to be solved.
So if anything, concentration is better on our side of the house because we're also just concentrating on an issue, and that issue just happens to be structural in nature. And the reason you don't get trickle-down benefits is because you're applying a band-aid solution. You're trying to reduce sentencing for one specific crime, but you're not changing the structures that led to that crime being over-sentenced in the very first place, whereas we do this on our side of the house with the political will we garner. So the third reason as to why we get more buy-in then is that we also just appeal to more communities as well, so we get better intersectionality. And look, not all communities or not all different marginalized identities are affected by drug crimes, but there's often other people or other identities that are affected by marginalization or by like poor jury selection or like just over sentencing as well. It looks like women who often have their abusers or domestic assaulters get off scot-free because biased juries with historic like prejudices accuse them of just like asking for it, or that they're too emotional and they're overreacting. And this means that their assaulters often don't face sufficient punishment. It looks like perhaps LGBTQ individuals could often get prosecuted historically for being groomers because people who are on these juries or perhaps had like these internal prejudices against them. Or perhaps it's just like, everyday moderate middle-class people who might just have like relatives in prison and have people they care about being affected by the poor prison system, and therefore are willing to support causes like prison reform as well. So these people, crucially, don't suffer from drug crimes as a specific issue, but they do benefit from structural reform that makes the system more fair, that corrects for things like, implicit biases or certain prejudices, and we get more political will amongst these people as well. The fourth reason as to why our side is better then is that we get better long-term solvency, and this is quite key. Where I observed in a POI that OO, or off in general, hasn't gotten any change, but even if they did get change in their best case scenario, they're more prone to backsliding as well. And this is because changes to sentencing often fluctuate with changes in political administrations and different circumstances. So you can look at, for example, in the aftermath of 9/11, like sentencing for certain communities like skyrocketed, and it's basically just very subject to circumstances and administrative bodies. So even if op got changed, like another president like Trump could just come into office and undo it, and all of it was basically for nothing. The comparative is a world where it's far harder to backslide on structural change because it just looks far worse. Like, what realistically are you going to say? Like, let's make all of our juries white and male again. Let's break down and purposely ruin our prison system. It's far harder to backslide on structural change in this way. But the final reason as to why our case is better is not only to get better efficacy to unlock any impacts in the very first place. Our solution or our cause is just more impactful in the first place. where structural changes means that sentencing for all crimes involving minorities or marginalized identities just gets more fair. So we can also co-opt OO, where we agree with OO that drug crimes are unjustly sentenced, but we can also include this on our side of the house when minorities in general are given more empathy, when they're given more, fairness in the criminal justice system, but other crimes do as well. So we get the maximum amount of impact in this debate. For all these reasons, we're so proud to propose.
We thank the member of government for that speech. Can we now have the member of the opposition please here?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Excellent. Let me just get my timer up. I'll take a POI probably around 5 minutes. Please put all the POIs in the chat. Okay. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1, go. We're going to be charitable to government and say the reform movement is going to focus on these non-violent, non-drug offenses. So the question is, why should the reform movement focus on this? Because not all crimes are made equal. And so we're going to justify this in 2 ways, in a much more granular level than opening opposition does. I think firstly, it is simply that drug reforms and achieving those drug reforms have an impact on a far greater number of people than on the reforms on non-violent, non-drug offenses. And we're going to explain why. But secondly, right, and this is even more important, right, is that drug incarcerations on our side of the house would increase without the reform movement. That means that there's a huge number of pressures to increase the number of drug incarcerations from 1990 up to today, meaning that far more people would end up in prison, etc., on our side, compared to other non-violent crimes, which we believe would naturally decrease even without the reform movement putting their hand into it. So therefore, we're explaining specifically why we need the reform movement to deal with drugs, and on far more granular level. Okay, so firstly, why are drugs the vast majority of crimes? I think firstly, just the info slide gives you a statistic, which is 24% in 1990. Notice that this statistic also includes violent crimes, of which there are a huge number of violent crimes. Notice the criminal justice system often disproportionately incarcerates violent crimes. These are people going to prison, so a large proportion of them just empirically are. But secondly, right, notice the position of the USA is on the border with Mexico, which means that there's a huge number of drugs that are going into the USA from Mexico. It's a massive economy. But thirdly, there's huge incentives to trade these drugs and sell these drugs compared to non-violent crimes like shoplifting or other non-violent crimes like white-collar crime, right? Notice the accessibility of it and the need for it. It's much harder to do shoplifting because it's much easier for someone to catch you to do shoplifting, but it's also harder to make an income from shoplifting. You're going to hit thousands of stores to even make enough money to make ends meet. Notice that drug dealing, you can do it in secret, so you're far less likely to get caught doing it, but also you can make far more money from it economically by selling it. And notice that this is particularly true for ethnic minorities and those who are unable to find, and those in poverty who are unable to find stable employment. This is a huge incentive to engage in drug dealing, and really there's not really a comparative as to give you such great economic returns from non-violent, non-drug offenses. So just the scale of it means that I think we structurally prove far more people would be benefiting from drug reforms on our side. But secondly, without the movement, drug incarcerations would go up, whilst other non-violent, non-drug related crimes would go down in history, right? Because without this, right, and with what you've heard from opening half, the debate would be symmetric, right? If both sides achieve reforms, then both sides will get fewer people incarcerated, regardless of what crimes they do. But we're specifically explaining how you're going to get more drug incarcerations in the future for drugs specifically. Several reasons for this. First, Bush and Clinton heavily pushed this as a policy position that they were holding to be tough on drugs. Why? Because by being tough on drugs, they symbolically try and show themselves that they are pushing back against crime and securing the USA. Notice the USA is coming out of a period of turmoil, particularly racialized turmoil with the civil rights movement. It means that there's a huge push from Bush and Clinton to do this. But secondly, there's a huge amount of existing taboos on drug use that just don't exist on things like shoplifting, or things like white collar crime, which means that these taboos need some powerful narrative force to push back against those taboos, which we believe the reform movement is able to do. For example, the reason these taboos exist is due to the historical legacy from things like prohibition, but religious organizations like Christianity characterizing these things as like letting the devil into you. You know the phrase like devil's lettuce, right? And thirdly, right, there's also historical legislation, which means that drugs have been heavily criminalized, particularly with racial motivation against like Black people, because, for example, like the illegalization of cannabis, but the legalization of alcohol, right? Thirdly, right, there's huge numbers of racial undertones and fear. The public is extremely scared of the other, right? So there's a very poor understanding amongst the public from poor people and from ethnic minorities. And often these are the two groups of people who use the drugs most. So these are the groups of people that people are most likely to continue to be against into the future. And lastly, because this is such a large source of inmates, the prison industrial complex in the USA is likely to focus on incarcerating them and encourage the government to continue incarcerating drug users, because it's such a number of young, able-bodied people, which is likely a characterization of people who deal drugs and engage in non-violent drug crimes. Okay, so all of these mean that on the comparative, things like shoplifting are far less taboo, right? Notice that things like corporate capture means that non-violent, non-drug offenses such as like white-collar crime are increasingly legitimized and increasingly less illegal. But also things like these things are much less taboo. So like Clinton administration is much less able to push back against those in their like narrative to be tough on crime, right? It's much harder to like scare people about shoplifting when even Christianity allows you to shoplift if you're desperate, right? And if you're desperate. So it's much harder to get the public against those and use that as an electoral slogan than it is to use drugs. Okay, so why is this extremely important? This is where the case comes to a crux, because we're going to explain why specifically the reform movement is uniquely powerful at fighting against drugs compared to all the other non-violent, non-drug crimes. And this is much better than the OO analysis, because OO gives you something generic about there not being enough money. I mean, like everything, loads of things don't have enough money. We give you specific analysis of the components of this movement and how they're specific to drugs. Okay, so first thing, there's a huge amount of public messaging, and this is extremely powerful to contrast against the government messaging. And this looks like specifically explaining the narratives of how drugs are fine, and specifically explaining how Bill Clinton and Bush are wrong with regards to this, right? So they try and push back against this. This looks like things like commissioning documentaries where they talk to former drug dealers, they talk to the horrors of the incarceration system on those drug dealers, they speak and understand why people use drugs in the first place. And these documentaries help breed emotion amongst people who otherwise would never have interacted with these people. Thus, we are able to push back against drug-specific taboos on our side of the house, right? But secondly, they're able to focus on the collection of statistics and data specific to drugs and incarceration, but also investigate specific policy positions, such as decriminalization of drugs or new sentencing guidelines for drugs. Notice you get far greater spread on their side when you focus on such a wide variety of different crimes. But secondly, it's much harder to draw up the public emotion for these crimes, right? Who's going to be emotional about someone who's had to pay a traffic fine? Who's going to be emotional about someone who's committed wire fraud, right? These things are much harder to draw up emotion, considering the things that the reform movement does. What they're very good at is documentaries and research and trying to draw up public sympathy. And this is specifically very powerful for drugs, because the reason why people are against drugs is because they are scared of drug users, because they don't understand why people use drugs. This group specifically does it. And lastly, they're able to target legal cases and pushback. By changing even one law, this impacts every drug user, right? Whereas on their side, they have to change many different acts, and this is much harder to do and much less impactful because it impacts far fewer people. For all these reasons, extremely proud to oppose.
We thank the member of the opposition for that speech. Can we now have the government whip, please? Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Yes, you are.
Thank you. All right, starting my time in 3, 2, 1. The CO and OO case are completely based on the degree of impact they're able to have on people. I think both teams fall at the point which the info slide already declares the very minimal impact they were able to achieve for the past 50 years in America. I think it's sensible then to assume that there's very little impact that this movement has actually made, and therefore we can only discuss the internal changes that actually happened because of this movement thus forth. All right, let's deal with CO first then. The first thing they tell us is about like the degree of impact, and I've basically already responded to this, but the second thing they tell us is a bit more important. They tell us that drug incarcerations would increase without the reform movement. 3 responses to this. The first one is that CO spends a lot of time trying to characterize how much pushback and criminalization drug users dealt with. The thing is, the tougher the state is on these drugs, the less likely the movement is to succeed. Their own example is also self-mitigatory. The fact that Bush and Clinton got elected shows that most citizens did not believe in the movement and voted against it. Secondly, the reform movement is not uniquely capable. This is some crazy debate land argument, all right? The movement's capacity to gain success is symmetric on both sides because their success is almost completely dependent on their external impacts. Their internal decision-making or their internal ability to garner information isn't unique to this movement. This is just information that's readily available. This movement just happens to have the people who want to get this information, right? But when we tell you we have better trickle-down benefits, this is the third response, we get much better benefits to the people who are incarcerated than the very minimal OP benefits on this. OP wants decriminalization, which I'm going to explain, which is very difficult to get when I respond to OO. But we get a better degree of change though, because first off, the most harsh sentencing is for minorities. So when we're able to get fair trials or fair, like, I don't know, permits for house arrests or house searches and whatnot, I think that these become things that actually are able to propagate into the types of like lesser degrees of sentencing that is so important for these minorities to be able to live well in the first place. All right, I think that it's important to point out that our counterfactual just has better efficacy, and it's also more likely than the Gov counterfactual, and I don't think it's entirely different from the Gov counterfactual either. Insofar as Gov gives us a very generic stance of, we can support many things, we tell you the specific things that we will try and support. I think it's very likely we're going to support these things at the point which our movement is built out of the minority communities that have created them. I think that this is why it's the most likely counterfactual. We tell you that our movement is more likely to be successful than the clearly very unsuccessful reform movement in this in the past 40 years. The first reason for this is just that we have much better optics for moderates, right? So people perceive drug crimes as quite bad, which is why you struggle to gain buy-in. People tend to latch onto drug crimes themselves and play on stigma that's associated with these crimes. And moderates just believe in broad values of justice and equality. So we're able to get much more solidarity from minority communities. So think of like Black conservatives who probably also dislike drugs, but at the same time, they're probably willing to try and vote for things that are generally beneficial towards combating racism. Now, OO gives us this POI that like we might have trickle down, but it's hard to attribute all of these issues into one issue, or all these resources into one issue. But I think there's a couple responses to this. The first one is that we are really just dealing with one issue. Our issue just happens to be structural, as Elizabeth very brilliantly tells us, right? So when we have these structural things that are able to garner trickle down benefits, we're simply just going to have a bigger impact at the point which we are able to get the buy-in that's necessary, but we also get the benefits that OO wants to claim. The thing is, OO is fighting a losing battle. In fact, their closing half tells us why this is a losing battle. It's a losing battle because the government and the stigma is not something which a singular movement can change individually. It is something that maybe progressivizes over time, maybe it doesn't. But at the point, in the past 40 years, there's clearly a very large stigma. Even today, there's a very large stigma against users of drugs, right? We grew up being taught that drugs are bad and that we should never do them. At this point, it's very difficult to say that, well, the people who do drugs are not just alienated and different from ourselves. This is why OO is impossible to win, because it's impossible to get change when this is the common social narrative. And I think the end of OG then, I think they're left quite vulnerable to opposition because OG barely explains why the things you get out of structural reforms are going to be better or more applicable. Insofar as Op Bench believes that we should prioritize the drug reforms over everything else. The first thing is backsliding though, because I think that on Op, you get a degree of backsliding. Elizabeth tells us that it's likely that these are going to become less or more popular dependent on the types of policies that change and the types of people who are in administration. You don't get backsliding on Gov because the jury composition political stance should progressivize like the rest of the world when it tends towards equality. That is the difference. The second thing is that we have significantly better structural benefits from OG. I think it's very fair to say, yeah, I don't really know what the benefits of having better traffic stops are, but I think it is very fair to say that we give you the better examples here. We tell you that we have drug reform. Beating the war on drug isn't to lessen the degree of the ideology of drugs being harmful. This is to say we should, this still says that we should, for example, incarcerate Black people because they use heroin, or this screams that drugs are horrible and primarily colored people who use drugs are bad people, just that drugs are less bad, right? I think that this makes the reform significantly more difficult to do because the offsetting of inequality within the justice system has waterfall effects on drug offenses as well. Sending police into people's homes to search for cocaine simply because of their skin color. The jury is also no longer a pool of upper-class individuals who will never empathize with your experiences. These are the types of structural benefits that I think are significantly more likely when you push for the types of changes that you want on CG. I'll take a POI from OO before I move on.
Yeah, the issue with your extension is it's kind of high burden. We tell you why it's possible to cause change on these crimes, but we get no such mechanism on how you solve these nebulous systemic problems. I don't even know what these systemic problems are. I have not heard a single example.
I just gave you 2 examples, and I don't think it's that you prove that it's likely you're going to solve your problems. All you prove is that these problems could have been solved, but when we look at the motion, there was a 4% change over the past 50 years, which could honestly just be a natural shift of the police system, and the movement created absolutely no delta whatsoever. So if OO wants to claim a delta, they have to first prove why this delta is 1, completely attributed to this movement, and 2, why a 4% delta is greater than whatever delta that is significantly bigger you're getting from CG is going to be better, right? So I think that what we're able to tell you, first off, I'll explain the 2 examples I gave. The first one is just that you're going to look for significantly less homogenous juries, so juries that are not primarily white when you're trying someone who is black. And I think that it's also significantly more important here that we are we're changing the ways that we like permit police to maybe search homes and allow them to maybe not search people's homes simply based on like ideas of suspicion because of their ethnicity and whatnot. I think these are the types of structural changes that actually make an impact on people. And note, people are willing to get these types of changes because these are ideas that align with everybody within the community. People in the community are relatively non-violent. People are not all non-drug. I think that this is the main issue. All right, let's quickly respond to OO then, because OO only explains why nonviolent stances cause you to get support, but that's symmetric. It's unclear what the delta is on drugs. So CG exclusively proves why we get more capital. The first one is the narrative of drugs being bad persists relatively evenly. It's difficult to get people, even those who oppose drugs use, to buy in. It's therefore difficult to garner unified buy-in from communities for nonviolent drug offenders. On the counterfactual, it's much easier to gain this buy-in because communities will line together to support change against all racial biases in juries, and things like letting men get off easily in crimes against women will gain much more buy-in than non-violent drug crimes. We're able to prove the delta in this debate, and we're the only team to do so. So proud to propose.